Hey there, welcome back to the Curators. We have a special guest today, Dr. Peter McCullough, who is a world-renowned internist, cardiologist, and epidemiologist based in Dallas. Dr. McCullough is the Chief Scientific Officer at the Wellness Company, the President of the McCullough Foundation, and the co-author of The Courage to Face COVID-19. He has broadly published on a range of topics in medicine with over 1,000 publications and over 700 citations in the National Library of Medicine. Dr. McCullough has dozens of peer-reviewed publications on the infection and has commented extensively on the medical response to COVID-19 in The Hill, on America Out Loud, and on Fox News Channel. Dr. McCullough has testified multiple times in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, the European Parliament, and at least 5 different state legislative bodies. Please join me and my special co-host, Dr. Elena Monarch, as we dive into critical medical challenges in our society with Dr. McCullough. We at the Curators believe that this is fundamentally a political problem with a political solution, and we do not offer any medical advice here. Thank you.
Here we are 5 years into the pandemic. No hospital system claims to be any good at treating COVID. We still have not seen COVID mortality statistics for the Mayo Clinic and Harvard and Emory and Michigan. I mean, this is astonishing. Every single meeting with Trump on the social distancing, lockdowns, masking, and contagion control measures. Can you imagine if I was chosen to be in the White House? Oh my gosh, it would have been so different. It would have been all on early treatment. We never would have advanced these vaccines.
It's not that we're anti-vax, it's that we can't mandate vaccines for children that may have a breach of their blood-brain barrier. It's not healthy.
If somebody actually wants change, wants to actually alter those issues, they're going to vote for me. We need to be building up and fortifying our democratic institutions.
That's not what the Constitution was written for. It was written for at the times when it's inconvenient.
Welcome to the Curators Podcast, a place for the Kennedy curious.
Hello, everyone. This is Paul with the Curators, and I am joined by Elena Monarch, who many of us know from a prior podcast. Thank you for being with us, Elena.
Thank you.
And we have a special guest here today, Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough, thank you for being here and taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to open up this discussion, rather than get into some technicals, which I'm sure we will get into. I just want to get a sense of what it's been like for you over recent years. And to that end, I want to highlight an article that you wrote in The Hill back in August of 2020, which was about 6 months into the pandemic. And you were among, if not the first prominent physician to bring some questions into the whole process and the protocol for COVID treatment, not only from the standpoint of putting the patient first, of course. And here's a quote from that article. Lastly, and most importantly, the vaccines may simply be modestly effective, meaning there is partial immunity but no guarantee of freedom from future infection. And then you go on to say, vaccine stakeholders, including government agencies, should not hold up treatment now in the gamble for a future panacea, even if it comes at warp speed. So those are a couple of concepts where I felt like, no one really has the market cornered on truth. But you seem to have a minority opinion, which history shows is an extremely important aspect of getting to the truth. And so, given that, and since then, it seems like many people have held you up as a hero. I've come to consider you heroic in so many ways, as have millions of others. And yet others, you've kind of brought on both sides of that as almost like a wedge issue. So what has it been like for you personally over the last 4 years after that started in 2020?
I think it's interesting you zeroed in on that that op-ed in The Hill, August of 2020. I'm the only public figure in the world who, in writing, questioned the vaccine development program. I even went back to the Children's Health Defense. They held a webinar in the summer of 2020, but it was generally about vaccines. It was generally with people who, were questioning the childhood vaccine schedule. And they said, yeah, the COVID vaccine, we would question them too. But there wasn't anybody who kind of put it in writing. It is so interesting that somehow I was positioned to do that. Now, by invitation, I was writing op-eds in the Hill with Scott Atlas. Now, Scott Atlas was chosen to go in the White House. And according to Scott's book, he spent every single meeting with Trump on social distancing, lockdowns, masking, and contagion control measures. Can you imagine if I was chosen to be in the White House? Oh my gosh, it would have been so different. It would have been all on early treatment. We never would have advanced these vaccines. And, we would have had a completely different history. I mean, just a choice of one person versus the other, just a giant divergence in what would have been U.S. history.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any sleepless nights?
I tell you, I had some busy nights as people got sick. What happened is our whole health system collapsed. Do you know the vast majority of doctors never faced a COVID patient? They never attempted to help somebody avoid hospitalization and death, even if it meant just a telemedicine visit or a phone call to get in medications. This is what really was astonishing to me. Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, which is a few thousand doctors in the United States, typically America's best doctors that graduate at the top of their class. They came out with, in October of 2020, a home treatment guide, early treatment protocol that was based on the McCullough protocol. But they are the only medical society that's chartered, established, that was essentially putting on their backs the care of the entire nation. There wasn't a single government agency. The big ticket medical associations, AMA, American College of Physicians, American Chest Physicians, none of them actually had any interest in treating patients and helping them avoid hospitalization and death. And later on, AAPS was joined by the Frontline Critical Care Consortium, FLCC, and then American Frontline Doctors, and people pitched in. But we estimate a small number of doctors with multi-drug protocols. We carried the nation. You can imagine without us, the hospitals would have been absolutely flooded, would have been actually overloaded.
There's a quote in the book Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote, The Real Anthony Fauci, and it's really right at the beginning of the book, and he quotes John Abramson from Harvard Medical School. He says, "The first step is to give the illusion that the primary purpose of modern medical research is to improve Americans' health most effectively and efficiently. In our opinion, the primary purpose of commercially funded clinical research is to maximize financial return on investment, not health." Assuming that quote is accurate, it sounds like the primary motivation was not so much putting the patient first through this COVID process, but having some corporate interest really placed ahead of the patient. Would you agree with that statement generally?
No, not completely. I mean, Operation Warp Speed was a clearinghouse where companies could come forward with products, and we had to negotiate with the FDA and with the National Institutes of Health. It's very important. And I was involved with two projects that we had to bring forward. One was the Modulon cell-based vaccine, and the other one was a Japanese product via Bayer, which was the Rematroban. So I dealt with it process firsthand. The pharma companies were not driving it. It was clear the government agencies were driving it. With COVID, the pharma companies, they were just the suppliers. And, our government agencies had already pre-decided it was going to be a messenger RNA focused vaccine product line that was going to be the primary response. We had an antigen-based vaccine get on the market, Novavax. It never got any promotion or advertising by the CDC, no mention in the press, yet it was the only non-genetic choice that we had. So there was a collusion between the messenger RNA consortium, which was largely a biodefense consortium. And then what happened was, in our case, it was Pfizer, Moderna they essentially became the shields, like a cover organization. They don't produce the products themselves. They were just kind of positioned in this choreography.
And Dr. McCullough, for those who do not know, why weren't we able to repurpose drugs or to do really good studies on the repurposing of drugs early on?
The National Institutes of Health, which would be the funding agency through Operation Warp Speed, they absolutely positively essentially killed multi-drug development. So they very slowly allowed Paxlovid and molnupiravir to come through. Remember, it was 2 years before Paxlovid was approved. 2 years. I mean, 2 years of no EUA oral therapy. The Rematroban, which was a great product, which is anti-inflammatory, anticoagulant, never saw the light of day. We had Favipiravir, which was used in Russia, some countries in Asia. It was presented to Operation Warp Speed, never saw the light of day. I mean, this is a tragedy. The Modulon vaccine, which was a BCG cellular-based vaccine, we had proposed basically for nursing home, nursing home patients who had not yet had COVID, still at risk. Again, never saw the light of day. So what we saw was a predetermined approach, a vaccine-only approach, and that if all other options could be effectively suppressed or delayed, then the public would have been presented with only one solution, and that was mass vaccination.
Mm. And we're talking about using treatments that we knew were effective and safe, that had gone through FDA approval, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and so forth. And I know you had mentioned those as part of the early treatment protocol. I heard Dr. Pierre Corey, talking about that as well. And it seemed to run into a political wall when it was presented as a real solution for people, as opposed to having these vaccines mandated. Was that your experience?
I agree. A lot of people don't know that, the very top of the McCullough protocol, which is the first published and most widely used multi-drug treatment protocol in the world for COVID-19, the very first part of it is virucidal nasal sprays and gargles. So it turns out nasal sprays and gargles were more effective than vaccines, more effective than the oral drugs. I mean, this is astonishing. Do you know, every company making one of these products was immediately sued by the Federal Trade Commission under a new law, which was called the COVID-19 product advertising law. They basically said any company that's going to try to do anything in COVID, they could easily be accused of misleading the country. And in fact, there was a randomized trial, first authors Bamforth and colleagues, randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of a xylitol-based nasal spray. And it reduced new cases of COVID by over 70%. I mean, talk about safe and effective. There was a double-blind, prospective, randomized controlled trial of iodine, dilute iodine, and there's actually dilute iodine, eye drops, nasal sprays, and gargles in people acutely sick with COVID. And there was over an 80% reduction in the PCR test positivity by 3 days. It reduced the risk of hospitalization and death substantially. And yet the iodine-based companies in the United States, Cofix RX, Betadine, xylitol-based, which would have been the Clear and Neomed, they were impeded and suppressed. Then we got into hydroxychloroquine. The FDA went full bore against hydroxychloroquine, completely against ivermectin. We saw colchicine. Colchicine was invaluable as a treatment in this middle layer of the McCullough protocol. There's 39 meta-analyses of summarizing dozens and dozens of studies. Colchicine had a 30% reduction in mortality, never mentioned by the agencies, never put into the National Institutes of Health protocol. The best randomized trial in all of COVID is called the Co-Corona trial, over 4,000 patients, coordinated from Montreal Heart Institute. It was actively suppressed. We saw aspirin, corticosteroids. Vitamin D was actively suppressed. One of the vitamin D manufacturers, led by Eric Naputi, he was essentially tied up in a court case based on this COVID Federal Trade Commission legislation, and professionally attempted to destroy him on this. We saw suppression of monoclonal antibodies. They were high-tech, Operation Warp Speed, expensive. This just should have been the darling of big pharma, right? And we had manufacturers like Lilly and Sanofi. No, these things were taken off the market in a matter of weeks by the FDA for theoretical reasons. They were always safe and effective. I administered many doses of these. So I can tell you, this was not just about cheap generics. Even the expensive stuff was suppressed. This was actually about mass vaccination of the public. This is very important. It's not about big pharma. It's about the hubris of mass vaccinating the world.
Hubris versus humility, which is, the stark contrast there. And how much do we really know about the human body, Dr. McCullough? Percentage wise, it's a very small percentage. So there ought to be no room for hubris. There ought to be plenty of room for humility. And I can say that as a Wall Street person. I always say a genius is somebody who's right 51% of the time on Wall Street, and so we need to take that and not, create these mass vaccinations. To me, that's insane. Where's the immunity assessment program if somebody doesn't even need a vaccine, right? Has that been discussed? Have we learned enough to be able to apply those lessons?
Well, recall that the clinical trials of the vaccines always excluded COVID-recovered patients, even suspected COVID-recovered, because everyone knew, the FDA and the companies knew, that once you had COVID, you couldn't benefit from a vaccine. Yet when the vaccines were rolled out, everyone was advised to take them. Before you knew it, everyone was mandated to take them, and who worked for big employers wanted to go to school and etc. This violated all the rules. But more importantly, it was a colossal error to mass vaccinate into a highly prevalent pandemic. We should never do this. The next pandemic, we shouldn't think first about vaccines, because if we mass vaccinate into a highly prevalent pandemic, all we're going to do is encourage resistant strains of the virus and prolong the pandemic. And that's exactly what was done. The Spanish flu pandemic was over with in 2 years. We've had now, going on 5 years of misery with this because of mass vaccination. It's markedly extended the period of time that it's a clinical concern.
Now, speaking of the next pandemic, I'm reading some of your work and John Leake as well. And I'm seeing some things about H5N1, the bird flu, and the lab down in Athens, Georgia, and some of the work that's being done there. Can you talk about what you've learned in that situation?
Well, let's. I want to build a base here, Paul and Elena. I want to ask you two a question. In 2012, were you aware that our military had launched a messenger RNA vaccine program called the DEP-P3 to end pandemics in 60 days?
No.
No, I wasn't aware. Mm-hmm. Were you aware that in 2017, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health held a planning meeting with published transcripts called the SPARS pandemic? It said there will be a coronavirus pandemic. Were you aware of that?
No.
I was not.
Were you aware in 2019, at that time in 2019, that there was a filmed event called Event 201, where it was discussed and videotaped and written up with government officials and the Chinese CDC director that we were going to have a coronavirus pandemic, and that there was plans to cover up the origins of it, how to manipulate social media? Were you aware of that in the fall of 2019?
I wasn't then, but I have heard about that meeting.
Same here.
Okay, but here's my point. There's three of us. We're kind of, none of us were paying attention to these milestones. None of this was written up and published in the New York Times or Washington Post. It was never on CNN or Fox or Real America. It wasn't in Medscape. It wasn't even messaged to the, I mean, think about this. This wasn't even messaged. So that shows you kind of the general lassitude and blindness that we had to this whole space. This whole space of pandemic preparedness planning was churning for a couple decades. And so I point the listeners to one book called COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey by Peter Breggin. It's one of the first books out. It's got well over 1,000 citations, but the timeline Breggin is in the back. There's 36 pandemic preparedness planning events that you can find in history. There were 25 of them that generated written documents and 6 that were filmed. You can actually review the tape like Event 201. I didn't know about any of those.
Dr. McCullough, I have a question for you now. So, whether it was conspiracy or whether it was carelessness, right? Whatever perspective people have, can you identify for us, like, what does our next president, we have an election coming up, what does our next president need to do or could possibly do to set us up to get out of this mess, to actually have our best interests at heart, and to do things completely differently? I'm looking for a leadership that accepts the use of vitamins, things like vitamin D, zinc, considers the outdoors part of medicine, considers exercise a part of medicine. So anyway, I have my biases. What does our next president need to do to protect the citizens of this country so something like this does not happen again?
Boy, so much to do. I want to tackle that bird flu question too, but let me just say in general, I think, all experts agree we need to clean house at all the agencies. They become bloated. We're approaching 500 government agencies, 500. Right. And over the course of the Trump administration and the Biden administration, we've seen the 2 biggest spending administrations in history. They've been terrible financial stewards of the country. They have promoted big government. Both of them have. And it's been, and the consequences have been severe for the country. Now we have government agencies essentially spying on the citizens. Our public health agencies have been weaponized against us. So we need to clean house. I had presented in the U.S. Senate in 2020. It became basically the foundation for discussions there on pandemic response, that we should always have 4 pillars for the next emergency. The first pillar is contagion control. How do we control the spread of whatever's invading us? Turns out nasal sprays and gargles were the winners, not masks. Yeah. So masks never reduced the spread, but nasal sprays and gargles did. To this day, they still have not been mentioned by our government agencies, to show you how inept they are. Pillar number 2 is early treatment. Early treatment should be the biggest pillar. We should always have a team of experts. And Americans now have learned they want to see doctors in Washington who actually see and examine patients face to face, to actually know what they're talking about. That doctor better go into hospitals and show some leadership and examine patients, better be seeing them in the office, go out in the field. None of this media personality stuff. We need real doctors. And then the third pillar is hospital treatment. And we need to absolutely positively call on hospital leadership every month to show up and tell us about new innovations, new protocols. We need comparative statistics on hospital mortality. Here we are 5 years into the pandemic. No hospital system claims to be any good at treating COVID. We still have not seen COVID mortality statistics for the Mayo Clinic and Harvard and Emory and Michigan. I mean, this is astonishing that hospitals, in a sense, have had no bravado in taking care of COVID patients. And then the fourth pillar is vaccination. And vaccination, if it serves a role, it's going to be far late into the pandemic, largely to prevent recurrences. It's possible a very, very safe, highly effective vaccine could protect a vulnerable group, like, let's say, nursing home patients or those in congregate living. But those 4 pillars of pandemic response ought to be there. We should have standing committees and be able to rotate in. We need leadership. We need clinical leadership. On the White House Task Force 1 and 2, there wasn't a single doctor who was actually an expert in the clinical syndrome COVID-19. It was no one who had treated patients early to avoid hospitalization and death. And in a sense, there was no accountability. We had 2 presidents and 2 administrations. They could not articulate the problem. The problem was Americans were getting sick, and some high-risk patients were being hospitalized, and some died. And virtually all the deaths occurred in the hospital. They could not articulate the problem. Through 2 administrations, the problems articulated were, we need to slow the spread, or we need to get a needle in every arm. Neither one of those things saved lives. So anyhow, that's tackling that question. I do want to move on to bird flu. And Paul and Elena, the reason why I went through that exercise is that none of us were at the time aware of the impending COVID-19 pandemic. We have been fairly warned about avian influenza or bird flu.
Mm-hmm.
And is that spreadable to humans?
This is what we know in a review by Lysette and colleagues from the UK. Bird flu has been around for over 100 years. So it comes in waves. It is a form of a virus, influenza, that affects birds. And because poultry and chicken are in close contact, it can affect them. The strategies for managing it over time have failed miserably. The 2 major strategies in handling the animals has been culling, that is, kill all the birds and hopefully eradicate the virus. But since it spreads so readily, that doesn't work. And then the other strategy is to vaccinate the poultry. Chinese have been doing that, and others. That doesn't work because then none of the vaccines are very good. They don't sterilize the animals from the virus, and so they spread it around. So the animals simply have to get natural immunity. That's essentially what's happened over the last several hundred years. Now, occasionally there's been a big enough inoculum where it spreads from the birds to a human. And over the decades, the majority of these cases have been in Southeast Asia. And sometimes in some of these families in Vietnam, what have you, they actually sleep with the chickens. So they get a lot of exposure. And in those legacy cases where there's no health care, no antivirals or antibiotics early, there's been nearly a 50% mortality rate. Now, that legacy mortality rate has been brought into the contemporary discussion of the current bird flu strain, which is H5N1 clade 2344B. This current strain, our work at McCullough Foundation has traced back to gain of function research emanating out of the USDA Southeast Poultry Research Center in Athens, Georgia, where they were doing serial passage experiments. It looks like they got it to pass into ducks. And the first animals that started getting sick were around this lab, at least a few hundred miles away. The ducks, by the way, are everywhere. They fly all over the place. They're the ones spreading it from place to place in the United States. It's interesting that the CDC, in all of their reports in the media, they've never asked, how is it spreading? It's so interesting. They say, well, there's an outbreak at Amarillo. Then there's one in Iowa and in Michigan. But they've actually never indicated that it's in the mallard ducks and other waterfowl that are flying around. To them, to the CDC, it's a mystery. It's just popping up here and there. It shows you the ineptitude of our public health agencies. But at McCullough Foundation, Nick Hulscher is our fellow, our lead author. We actually have a paper under peer review called The Proximal Origins of This. Now, gain-of-function research has been openly funded by the Gates Foundation and Anthony Fauci at the NIH, and they've been funding research for 2 decades now, mainly Dr. Kawakoa at the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine, and then Dr. Ron Fouché at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Now, they coordinate with the USDA lab. They're on papers together. They may even share samples. But the work of Kawakoa and Fouché is to get it to go into mammals and spread mammal to mammal. And as far as they've gotten is get it to ferrets, where they can aerosolize, spread it to one another. So this is very intentional. Now, the stated goals of doing this is to, quote, get ahead of nature to produce vaccines. That's kind of the the new industry that's developed over the last few decades.
That's their rationale.
That's their rationale. Now, listen, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, in 2021 said disease X, or the next pandemic, is bird flu. Gates Foundation has said that. World Economic Forum, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, founded by Gates and WEF, they've said bird flu is the next pandemic. Peter Daszak, EcoHealth Alliance, recently barred from any more federal research because he's part of the creation of COVID. He's also said this. So people are lathered up for bird flu. The government, this is very interesting. The USDA is taking the lead here. They control the VetMax PCR assay, and they are coming onto farms offering money for the farmers to have their animals tested. And when there's a positive animal by PCR, whether it's a false positive or not, then there's an order for culling or mass destruction of the entire flock, largely healthy birds, and the government's reimbursed for that. So it's happening across the United States. It's happening in Canada. And we have not seen large numbers of birds naturally dying in nature or even on these farms. We're seeing no adjudicated cases where there's animal pneumonia or by necropsy, animal death due to the virus. And in many ways, people are questioning this entire storyline of whether or not it is, in a sense, a created bird flu pandemic to get to the goal of vaccines for both animals and for humans. Canada and the United States don't vaccinate animals, but we think that's coming. And sure enough, last week, the European Union announced they bought 40 million doses of a human bird flu vaccine. And 2 days ago, Finland said they're going to start vaccinating people for bird flu.
So it sounds like whatever noble intentions there may be, on one hand, the unintended consequences that we're being faced with are just overwhelming that, and lead people like you, as I understand it, to want to see more of a ban on gain of function research. It almost begins to feel more like biological warfare than it does actual benefit to humanity. Would you care to comment on that?
Can you imagine if you were a not-for-profit organization like Gates Foundation or CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, or the EcoHealth Alliance, or the WHO? Could you imagine, or if you're a country and you hold a biological threat in one hand that can get the whole world sick, and then you've got a solution in the other hand, a vaccine? Can you imagine the power that one would have with negotiations? Peter Daszak at the EcoHealth Alliance in his Senate testimony, congressional testimony,
wow,
said that there are hundreds of samples in the Wuhan lab. And it makes you wonder, why is the Wuhan lab not being investigated more vigorously by anyone? Maybe they've got COVID 20 and 21 and 22 and on in the lab. I mean, we've already had one taste of this. The entire world can get sick with a laboratory-created strain of a virus. Now this work is going on. It's in the open. I agree. I think there should be a total ban on gain-of-function research. We ought to have an inventory of all the labs doing this. I'm on a standing Senate committee in Arizona. I've challenged the state of Arizona. Go do an inventory of universities on who's doing gain-of-function research. It's heavily funded by Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Wellcome Trust, funded by government agencies. Even when there's moratoriums, they simply go outside the United States and fund projects. I mean, this whole field of microbiology and virology is big business.
And the universities are very much part of that too, the university research. And then who owns that when they come up with something? A product, who ends up owning that, who gets the rights to it? You have some experience with that?
Well, intellectual property is a big ticket item at universities. There are some agreements where the universities hold the rights to royalty streams. With Moderna had several patents before 2019, And then they had a material transfer agreement with Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Barrick had already published in 2015 and 2016 the creation of primordial SARS-CoV-2. And in those papers in Nature Medicine and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, they called it a SARS-like Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 virus poised for human emergence. Boy, if that doesn't sound like COVID, I don't know what does. And sure enough, Moderna had written patents. And in 2019, what the real telltale is a material transfer agreement where Moderna is asking UNC Chapel Hill for some biological material to challenge their vaccine. This is in 2019. And you know what? This House Select Committee, chaired by Brad Wenstrup in the House, will not examine the two papers I mentioned and cited, and they will not examine the material transfer agreement. Why? Moderna co-owns the patent with the National Institutes of Health, and there must be powerful people who are experiencing this royalty stream from Moderna back to the government.
That sounds like misaligned incentives to me, Dr. McCullough. You had shared in a couple of interviews earlier in terms of observing and studying vaccine effects that, and you're an accomplished cardiologist, internist, epidemiologist. You've experienced an significant uptick in myocarditis. I think you're postulating there's a link between vaccines and the development of Alzheimer's disease. Possible link there, and I'm wondering if you could comment on those and your experience there, and also the potential link, if there is one in your mind, between vaccines generally and the increase in the rate of autism in America.
You know, a book that's influenced me greatly is called Illusions Dissolved. Illusions Dissolved, and It is about the history of vaccinations, and they spend time on smallpox, polio, and measles, and largely pertussis. Those four. If you know those four, you know them well. And the one thing I really noted was the early smallpox vaccines, starting in the mid 19th century, were basically lymph fluid from horses or cows that could not be sterilized, or was from humans, human to human. Vaccination. It didn't work. There were clear fatalities, people getting sick from staphylococcus, strep infections. There were no antibiotics back then, syphilis. And we got to the point where there was forced mass vaccination. Parents were put in jail if their kids weren't vaccinated. There were protests across Toronto, across the US Northeast. In England, it was so bad it led to the Anti-Vaccination League and ultimately legislation in 1902 in England that allowed it to be voluntary. That's the history of vaccines. So vaccines have a very, very dirty, dark history. A lot of people don't want to revisit that, but Illusions Dissolved by Humphreys is absolutely a terrific book. Now, fast forward with COVID-19, with that understanding of what happened in the mid-19th century, no surprise how we could get very quickly to mandated unsafe, ineffective vaccines with COVID-19. It's the exact same story. And what we've learned is the COVID-19 vaccines were a giant gamble, as I wrote in The Hill, because Pfizer, let's take Pfizer, Moderna, messenger RNA, since most people, 94% of people in the US who took a shot took those. It's the genetic code for the spike protein. The spike protein, let me get you a model. The spike protein is the lethal part of the virus. So here's the virus. The spike protein is this. This is a spike protein. It's on the surface. And there are many, many of these spike proteins on the virus. The genetic code codes just for the spike protein, but that's the lethal part of the virus. And when Pfizer and Moderna are injected, they produce unlimited amounts of spike protein for an unlimited duration of time. And the spike protein is lethal.
Well, and it's inflammatory. And as somebody who works with patients who have neuroinflammation, anything inflammatory, right? We could be talking about vaccines. Well, vaccines produce an immune response. And if your blood-brain barrier is broken, naturally, some of that immune response could reach parts of the brain that are then going to lead to psychiatric symptoms. And right now, there are so many people with pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric symptoms, PANDAS, neurocognitive disorders, which have exploded since I was in grad school at Emory University, where I got my PhD. That was, over 20 years ago. We did not have this level of neuropsychiatric symptoms. And at this point, it's like every other kid coming into my clinic is experiencing neuroinflammation at some level or another. Now, the good news is some of this is reversible, but the bad news is that most people have no idea, when you talk about the spike protein and inflammation, most people have no idea that can cross into the brain, and then there can be psychiatric sequelae. And instead, these kids are being shoved into psychiatry, being put on a whole bunch of psych meds. It has the implications of, spike protein, like the implications of this immune response. And Paul, you brought up autism. It boggles me. Like, I don't understand why it has not hit mainstream medicine that individuals with autism have a much higher increase of evidence of immune responses in the brain. So on autopsy, when you autopsied brains, you will find evidence that these patients have many more markers of neuroinflammation than people without autism. So autism, we talk about, does vaccine cause autism? Many patients with autism are suffering from immune insults to the brain. So it is all related.
I have a question for both of you. Is it fair to say, because I've heard this, that many of the studies that have been done that have debunked supposedly any link between vaccines and autism have been a function of blood test work that has been done, but that does not take into account the crossing of something into the blood-brain barrier, which would then not be picked up by a blood test. To your point, Elena, is there any evidence of that? Has there been any study done along those lines?
Well, I'll just speak from the research that I do and from what I'm reading. There's plenty of evidence that people, even in the blood, that individuals with autism, as well as individuals with bipolar disorder and psychosis, they have many immune abnormalities, even on blood work. But you also autopsies, like, you can't deny, when pathologists are looking at autopsies of the brain and they see that people with autism have all kinds of abnormalities in the brain associated with immune responses, then we should be all hands on deck about this. We should all be, autism is a devastating disorder. It hurts so many people. It costs a lot of money. There's unbelievable amount of suffering. If we now know that people with autism have more immune responses that are reaching the brain, that their blood-brain barrier is broken, we should have all hands on deck working to reverse this. And instead, it's, let's see how many of these drugs we can put someone with autism on, and will that serve as a Band-Aid for their symptoms? And so this is something that I ask about all the time. Like, why don't we care about this enough? Because we have a lot of smart people that I believe could unravel this and could help people with autism.
1 in 10,000 people back in the 1990s was the diagnosis rate of autism, and now it's, I believe, 1 in 36. That is not just simply attributable to better diagnostics.
And that's people with autism, never mind all the other mental health conditions that are way up. OCD, OCD, Tourette's, sensory processing disorders, even ADHD, a lot of these conditions are because the brain is under attack. Our children's and adolescents, like, their brains are under attack right now. And we used to, as neuropsychologists like myself, we used to be able to say, well, here's all these compensatory strategies we can use to compensate for some distractibility or some sensory issues or some motor tics. Well, now it's like the floodgates have opened. We don't have compensatory strategies that are sufficient to help somebody who has brain inflammation at this level. And it's going unchecked, and it's going on a long time.
And then there's the other things I mentioned too, right, Dr. McCullough, the myocarditis and Alzheimer's.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Because that's a more recent bit of information, I think, at least as far as I've seen.
Right. I wanted to finish on COVID before we move into general
Sure.
vaccines and autism. So what we know in general is that about 90% of people who took the vaccines, as far as we can tell, are fine. They're fine. And a marker of whether or not someone is okay is typically if they have no arm pain or just absolutely a minimal reaction. There's now been 3 sources of data suggest it's determined by what type of batch, the batch number. Someone got
Batches.
a hot lot. It's probably hyperconcentrated messenger RNA or contaminants or both. But it's due to the lot that people receive. So about 90% of people are fine. That means about 5 to 10% of people we're worried about. They typically have severe reactions early. The side effects are 5 to 10% is a big number when 2/3 of the world took a shot. United States, 75% of people took a vaccine, according to the COVID States program and several Rasmussen surveys and the readjusted CDC data. So, 25% didn't take a vaccine. I didn't take it. I'm a doctor. I looked at this carefully. It wasn't safe enough for me. I wish everybody would have said no. But what we know of those who took the vaccine, about 5 to 10% are in trouble. We're seeing damage of the heart, myocarditis. About half the time, there's no symptoms until there's a cardiac arrest. We're seeing cardiac arrest now years after the shots. Acceleration of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and arrhythmias. The second major area is neurologic stroke, ischemic and neurologic stroke, Guillain-Barré syndrome, small fiber neuropathy. To kind of weave into this discussion of autism, there's a preclinical study showing autistic behavior in animals who take the COVID-19 shot. The neuropsychiatric disorders are all open for investigation here. Alzheimer's, my clinical observation is that it's not Alzheimer's, it's not classic Alzheimer's, it's almost in between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And then the third area is blood clots, thrombotic, like we've never seen before. Several hundredfold increased risk of blood clots is shown in a paper by Rogers and colleagues and myself recently. Some of these can be fatal. Blood clots that are resistant to blood thinners, much larger than we've ever seen before in practice. And then the fourth area is immune system abnormality, Sjogren's syndrome, various forms of rheumatoid arthritis. There's immune vasculitis, kidney and skin involvement. Fifth emerging area of concern is cancer. We're not sure if that's going to need more work on there, but mechanistically, the vaccines, believe it or not, could cause cancer. I can't believe a single shot could be this damaging to the human body. One of the reasons why it is because this spike protein that I mentioned, this 1200 amino acid protein that the vaccine codes for, gets stuck in the human body, and it's resistant to various forms of proteases in the body. We can't get rid of it, much like some of the remnants of Lyme infection, Borrelia burgdorferi. Syphilis is another organism we can't get rid of. So the spike protein is everywhere. As Elena mentioned, it's been found in the brain for sure. The inflammation is all a response to the spike protein. That's what that is. So we see papers on long COVID where there's no mention of spike protein, and there's all this description of inflammation or cytokines. Well, that's because the spike protein is there. When studied, it's everywhere in the body, is long-lasting. Brogna and colleagues showed a circulatory in blood for at least 6 months, maybe longer. No wonder these people feel sick. And so what we found is our approach clinically has been to target the spike protein as the primary problem. Just trying to manage inflammation and leaving the spike protein alone is not, in my view, not working. And so we target the spike protein through a detoxification approach as a proposal right now. Soon, I hope we have real laboratory abilities to directly measure the spike protein. We measure it indirectly through antibodies. With the natural infection, the spike protein antibodies ought to fall off pretty quickly, and they do. But the vaccine, the antibodies are sky high for years. So That's what we know
yeah.
there. In the last few minutes, we could turn our attention to this tidal wave of autism, because I sense the tension there is really high.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that vaccines, listening to Bobby Kennedy talk about his defense of vaccine injured families over the years, and how he's been now vilified for it, public enemy number one. But you're cited in his book, and he talked about how there was this gold rush of vaccines after the 1986 law that exonerated vaccine developers from any liability. Well, guess what? You talked about power before, right? If I'm immune from any liability for any damage my vaccine may cause, lo and behold, we've gone from that DTP era in the 1980s. Now we have a CDC schedule that makes your head spin,
Mm-hmm.
and meanwhile we have this explosion in chronic diseases in this country, right, Doctor? 60%.
It's true. During childhood, the immune system is trying to, form itself as it's interpreted in the environment. Probably the single greatest immune stimulus now that a child receives is not the environment, it's this battery of vaccines. Do you know there's one agency that aspires to have 500 vaccines per child? I mean, this is really going all the way. A child today faces 108 shots. When I was a kid, it was 5 shots spaced out. When I was a kid, it was autism, as you said, 1 in 10,000. CDC says it's 1 in 36. Today, the seminal observation was made by Andrew Wakefield, a British physician, who 12 children he was carefully studying, and he described the lymphoid hyperplasia in the abdomen, a febrile response after the MMR vaccine, and then the development of autism, the characteristic neuropsychiatric disorder. And, that what was impressive in the Wakefield report was the parents' observation. The children were fine. They get this combination vaccine, and there was a reactogenic phase, sometimes a febrile seizure, and then the relatively rapid onset of autism. The parents chronicle this, and now the CDC, has publications on this. This clearly happens. Wakefield's paper stood the test of time, 12 years in Lancet, before, under tremendous outside pressure, Lancet retracts the paper. Authors are peeled off. People are suffer professional damage for this. But it turns out it was a seminal observation similar to that of Semmelweis. Semmelweis in Vienna, mid-19th century, was the first one to discover washing your hands reduces pelvic infections in women. Just like Rosenhill, first to describe that smoking caused lung cancer. In each one of these cases, it takes a few decades before the orthodoxy in medicine recognizes what's going on. With Wakefield, again, he publishes it in 1998. As Elena correctly points out, there's a couple hundred papers now showing the genesis of autism almost certainly is due to immune system neuromodulation, cytokines going up into the brain. It's a neuropsychiatric disorder where there's changes, hyperacusis in hearing. There's actually auditory and visual processing abnormalities, a range in intellectual function. And I agree, it should be an all hands on deck emergency issue to study the epidemiology of autism. And the reason why we're not making progress is the medical orthodoxy and agencies will not face the music that it could be due to hypervaccination.
Right. And when we start talking like this and people think that we're anti-vax, it's not that we're anti-vax, it's that we can't mandate vaccines for children that may have a breach of their blood-brain barrier. It's not healthy. This needs to be considered at an individual level. You can't treat every patient the same, especially because the blood-brain barrier is getting leakier. People under the age of 30 have a much higher increase in having a leaky blood-brain barrier and having neuroinflammation. So you can't just mandate a vaccine that's one size fits all. Everybody absolutely has to take this, or you're going to lose your job, or you're going to be kicked out of school, and so on. It's not taking into consideration the health of the brain, which has declined drastically in the last years.
So let me give, for the last few seconds, let me give our listeners some backup on this. Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, that's kind of the medical organization for the top doctors in America. They're usually typically the top people in their class. In 2000, passed a resolution to ban any vaccine mandate of any type. That's in year 2000, okay? Because the vaccines were not sufficiently safe, not effective, and it's not appropriate, as you mentioned, to give it to everybody. Now, 2023 World Council for Health complete moratorium on the childhood vaccine schedule, advising a kind of wait and see approach. As you pointed out, we're not anti-vax. I took 69 shots in the course of my life. I was hyper vaccinated. I asked my mom after I had mumps as a child, why did I take mumps vaccines? My mom says, I don't know. They told me to do it. So we've been over vaccinating children for decades, myself included. And the point is, it's wrong. Some people are indeed put in danger. Sadly, some end up with terrible disorders. And we should take a risk-based approach. It may be a child who has got severe pulmonary disease. Maybe they need the respiratory vaccines. A child with asplenia, the vaccines for encapsulated organisms. Healthcare worker like me going into healthcare, a hepatitis B vaccine, but it should always be voluntary. It should be based on risks and benefits. And I think we're cohesive on this. I hope everybody's learned a lot in this podcast. I'm going to have to leave it here, but thank you so much for having me on the program.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you. It's been a great experience. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
And let's see. We're going to highlight the fact that your colleague Dr. Sylvia Fogel tells us that doctors need to read primary data and not rely on this narrative that comes from above, which may be influenced by another agenda and doesn't really get down to that patient level that you're talking about, right?
Right. I think medical doctors, the way the training, I'm a PhD, I'm not an MD, but from what I understand from the MDs, I think that the way their training goes is very practical. You need to know how to, it's clinical work. They're not encouraged to do these big research projects or read original research studies, very, very critically, like a lot of PhDs are required to do. And in fact, we're almost, we're required to learn how to create studies and to publish. So you have a lot of MDs really relying on other people's interpretations of research studies. And they probably also, a lot of them don't have the time, I'm sure, in the way the medical system is working right now. They're seeing, 30 patients a day. They may not even have the time to read original research.
But the more localized we can get it, right, the better we are. Just like, if you think about it in terms of food intake, if I'm growing my own food, I'm localizing the source as much as possible, as opposed to, buying something from the shelves of a department store where God only knows what's been processed to get it to that point,
Right.
Right.
So, well, those are businesses too, right? Like food companies, those are businesses. They need to make money. They're not producing food. Most of the companies are not producing food to make you the healthiest person that you can be. They're producing food for profit.
Bobby Kennedy talks about something that you won't hear from politicians. He says that capitalism, we're in this to make money, but capitalism needs to be harnessed to a social purpose, where the reason to go into business is to enrich our communities, to make our neighbors better off, not to, extract from them for our own personal gain. So that the incentive, the motives, where are they? Where do they lie? And you try to highlight these misaligned incentives, and then you get accused of being a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
Right. I'm going to tell you something. I am a conspiracy theorist. You know why? Mm-hmm. Because I have a theory that there is a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm. What is it?
And I can go into depth about what that conspiracy is, but it's being waged against the American people, not just in healthcare, but in many other areas as well.
Yeah.
And I'm part of our work at the Curators is to highlight this and to recognize, to help people understand that this is a political problem first and foremost.
Yeah.
And it has a political solution.
Mm-hmm.
And that solution comes in the form of Bobby Kennedy, simply because he knows how to put the people first and not special interests.
Well, and he's already been digging the corruption out of these agencies. He's already sniffed it out. He's already brought so many of these agencies to court. He's proved himself already his whole life. He's proved himself. And he knows this stuff, Paul. Like when I ever heard him talking about the blood-brain barrier and brain inflammation, he knows what PANS and PANDAS is. He knows about Lyme disease. He knows about how immune responses can affect the brain. So, you have somebody running for president who cares enough to devote all this time to digging out the corruption and to wanting to protect children's brains. Why doesn't everybody, I don't understand, why doesn't every citizen in this country listen to what he's saying and understand he's trying to protect our children? Our children are sick. Their brains are under attack. They're sicker than they've ever been. Just 25 years ago, when I was in grad school, children were not this disabled. They did not have this many cognitive difficulties. There were children with ADHD. There were some children with slight sensory processing issues. There were some children with limited learning disabilities where it was very specific. Now children have a whole host of disorders all at once, and they're more severe, and it's getting harder to compensate, to provide ways for these children to compensate. And they're suffering, and the families are suffering. And I am so grateful to Bobby Kennedy for caring about this.
And you're suffering with them. I can hear it in your voice. It pains you to experience this.
Well, it does, because it is going on too long, right, Paul? I've been following this for a while, and I'm watching it get worse during my career. I'm watching it get worse. And it's painful. Yeah. It's
a powerless feeling too, because you know the solutions are there, that we need to get to the bottom of it. We know that Bobby Kennedy is the one who will get to the bottom of it, because that's his track record and that's his character. We've seen it demonstrated. But this narrative that comes from the powers that be want everyone to think that he's, this other person. Yeah. And we know that is all by design to try to throw us off. So that, I think, again, that's one of the main goals of the Curators, is to highlight this platform. And we know we have the truth on our side. I've never felt so compelled to get behind something with every fiber of my being, Elena. And I kind of get the sense you feel the same way. Well, and Bobby he's such a gifted reader of science. He knows the science. He and yet all of these so-called experts, pundits who criticize him, have never read the science.
I know. And on a positive note, Paul, one of the things that really keeps me going is that when you do unravel with individual families and patients, unravel the reasons for their psychiatric symptoms, you will find that so many of these patients can recover from brain inflammation. The blood-brain barrier can heal. A lot of people can recover from severe mental illness. And so that's another thing that really keeps people like me going. There's many of me out there where we're seeing people recover from psychiatric illnesses instead of having to live their whole lives on psych meds and still suffering through that. And that's all we want. We just want everybody to have the information to be able to untangle neuropsychiatric and psychiatric illnesses, and to suffer less and to get their lives back.
Incredibly noble cause that you've undertaken, and I think its importance has been elevated in recent years as well. Perhaps not by design, but that's the way things have unfolded. Yeah. And so, like I said, when we first got together with Sylvia, I'm very grateful to know both of you and to see the work you're doing. So thank you.
Paul. Yes, and thank you for doing such a great job on this podcast and for including me.
Okay, thanks very much.